The 20th of April 1939 marks Hitler's 50th birthday. To celebrate the occasion, Joseph Goebbels stages a grandiose spectacle in Berlin, demonstrating the Third Reich's military power. It sends a clear message to the Western powers not to mess with Germany. The march on the newly completed east-west axis lasts nearly 5 hours. The commander inspects his troops. Joseph Goebbels notes in his diary, "The Führer is fated like no other mortal has ever been." In the summer months of 1939, Hitler spends very little time in Berlin. He chooses to organize the war over Danzig and against Poland away from the Reich's capital. The majority of the German population is aware that peace in Europe is hanging by a thread. People hope that Hitler will once again achieve his goals without bloodshed. One journalist writes, "One can't help observing that people are enjoying themselves with reckless abandon." On the 31st of July 1939, the Führer attends the Day of German Art in Munich. A group of hobby filmmakers have prepared for this major event, and they document the proceedings using several cameras and expensive color films. Everybody who is anybody in the Third Reich is seated on the VIP rostrum that afternoon, eagerly awaiting the festive procession themed "Living Pictures of 2,000 Years of Germanic History." The pretentious parade carries the implication that not only the future, but also the past is National Socialist. The Nazi procession, writes an American observer, is the admission of Hitler's tireless plans of conquest. Hitler spends most of August on the Obersalzberg. The dictator receives only few guests on the Berghof. One of them, the Italian Foreign Minister Count Ciano. Hitler reveals to his ally that he has decided to attack Poland before the end of the month. SS Chief Himmler and Chief of Security Heydrich are to orchestrate incidents on the Polish border. Reich's Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop is the man who most influences Hitler's policy in August 1939. For weeks he had been negotiating with the Soviets over a rapprochement of the two countries to ensure that the Soviet Union does not interfere if Germany goes to war with Poland. Finally, on the 23rd of August, Ribbentrop flies to Moscow to conclude the treaty with the major ideological enemy of the Nazis. From Germany's viewpoint, the signing of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact means that the way for the attack on Poland is now clear.
It was a devil's pact, but a devil's pact that served both countries brilliantly well at the time. For Germany, it meant that the eastern flank was now secured. They could attack Poland with complete impunity from the point of view of the Soviet Union. And as regards the Soviet Union, the pact served to buy them time. Stalin knew that Hitler would at some point invade. He thought this would be in 1942-43, and if they could hold on till then, the Red Army would be ready. And therefore, from Stalin's point of view, the pact was very useful because it allowed the Soviet Union to have this time to build up the army. So this pact served its purposes for a while on both sides. What it meant for the West was that the war was not only certain, but it was certain in the near future.
Danzig becomes a plaything in Hitler's diplomacy of intimidation. The majority of the population is German, but the city is surrounded by Polish territory. According to the Treaty of Versailles, the Baltic seaport is under the auspices of the League of Nations. National Socialist propaganda demands that Danzig return home to the Reich, and few people believe that Poland's allies, France and Great Britain, will have their soldiers die for the sake of Danzig.
Danzig was simply the occasion, but Hitler had said quite specifically to the leaders of the armed forces, this is not about Danzig, it's about Lebensraum, about living space for Germany, about expansion, therefore. From the point of view of his relations with the Western powers, Hitler's view was, well, they didn't fight for the Sudetenland. Why would they then fight for Danzig? So his hope was that by focusing upon Danzig, he'd be able to break the link between the Western powers and Poland.
Mobilization in Germany begins on the 23rd of August. Hundreds of thousands of men fit for military service flock to the barracks across the Reich. The newsreel film suggests that, just as in 1914, the soldiers are keen to go to war. Neutral observers, however, see things differently. Everyone is against the war, writes a US reporter at the time. How can a country enter such a decisive war when its population is so war-weary? The Second World War begins on the 1st of September, 1939.
Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch nicht bereits regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 Uhr wird jetzt zurückgeschossen.
Already an hour before that, at 4:45 in the morning, German troops invade Polish territory. In the early morning hours, they take Danzig by surprise and seize all official buildings. The last remaining defenders of the city have no choice but to surrender. 2 days later, Great Britain and France declare war on Germany.
Even at this last minute, Hitler thought that some deal could be done that would keep the Western powers out of the conflict and prevent it being a general European war and just allow Germany to attack and destroy Poland. But the Western powers remained adamant throughout that they would insist upon Germany holding back from any attack on Poland. And when it came to it between the German attack on the 1st and the declaration of war by Britain and France on the 3rd of September, there were still diplomatic maneuvers going on, but now without very much hope, because the British insisted that they would do nothing now unless the Germans pulled back from Poland.
From the 4th of September onwards, the Führer is always close to the front. A rare amateur film has captured him during a visit to German troops in Poland. It's plain to see that Hitler is in his element. The war stimulates him so much that he insists on driving through the combat zones in an open car. Even before the commencement of the campaign, Hitler had declared that his target was the obliteration of Poland. As early as the 5th of September, the Chief of General Staff notes, the enemy is practically defeated. In view of the superiority of the Wehrmacht with its 1.5 million soldiers, Poland's last defenders surrender on the 6th of October. The armed forces pay tribute to the Führer with a victory parade on the streets of Warsaw. Now, only a coup or an assassination can stop Germany from descending irrevocably into barbarity. Army officers critical of the regime cannot bring themselves to act, yet on the evening of the 8th of November there is an explosion in a Munich beer hall. The explosive device goes off after Hitler has left the hall. He had to leave earlier than planned. The Nazis accuse Great Britain of being behind the attempt. However, the person responsible has already been apprehended by the border police when he tried to flee the country. Georg Elser, a carpenter, had constructed the bomb himself. His goal was to liberate Germany from its tyrant. Hitler proclaimed on several occasions, destiny had ordained him to take on this responsibility. Now this pathetic cliché phrase has become an iron law. An opponent of the regime writes in her diary, "It now appears that a terrible end would be more tolerable than terror without end."
Alles Lebensschwache geht in der Natur unfehlbar zugrunde. Wir Menschen haben gegen dieses Gesetz der natürlichen Auslese in den letzten Jahrzehnten furchtbar gesündigt.
The killing has long begun. Compulsory sterilizations have been permitted by law since 1933 to prevent offspring with hereditary diseases. To justify the elimination of the mentally handicapped, Nazi propaganda presents their murder as a release from suffering or a disposal of life unworthy of life. In October 1939, Hitler decrees the so-called Action T4, a program under which some 90,000 patients are murdered.
It is a lot easier to enforce radical measures in wartime. The first of these atrocious laws was Action T4, and its purpose was the obliteration of people with mental or physical disabilities. Actually, they had figured out a way to keep it anonymous for the sake of the relatives of the victims. The next of kin would receive a note saying that their child had died from pneumonia and that the ashes would be sent to them, or something like that.
At the beginning of 1940, Adolf Hitler receives workers' and farmers' delegations in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Hundreds of thousands of men were conscripted when the war started, and they are now lacking in industry and agriculture. It becomes vital to motivate the people on the home front. Armaments production does not meet the demands of the dictator. Initially, the development of the armaments program was based on the assumption that the war would start in 1942. Hitler, however, is not dissuaded from his plans of conquest. Preparations for an assault of German troops on Scandinavia under the codename Operation Weserübung, Operation Weser Exercise, are in full swing.
In den Morgenstunden des 9. April landeten in zahlreichen Häfen Norwegens und Dänemarks deutsche Truppen. Neugierig sehen die Kopenhagener der Landung immer neuer deutscher Truppen zu. Zur gleichen Zeit vollzog sich die militärische Besetzung Norwegens.
Wenn die Deutschen im Zweiten Weltkrieg ein Land
When the Germans took control of a country in World War II, the benchmark for its contributions to the Reich was twice the amount of the country's last budget. This is how the Nazi regime became fiscally stable. That's not to say that this was the only reason for the war, but it was a decisive motive nevertheless. Bearing this in mind, it becomes clear that this regime would never have been able to reach a compromise. It was unwilling to compromise from the start.
Es war von Anfang an kompromissunfähig.
Seit Wochen hören wir tagtäglich die Aufforderung, sich an der Metallspende für das Führergeburtstagsgeschenk zu beteiligen.
Excerpt from a Nazi television report on the strains on the population. Yet, not even the metal donations for Hitler's birthday on the 20th of April can solve the short supply of raw materials. People are happy to put up with such burdens, as in other respects the government leaves them more or less in peace. The soldiers provide for the urgently needed supplies. These images are shot by Edgar Forsberg, an army lieutenant stationed in occupied Poland. As of November 1939, all Jews have to wear a white armband with a blue Star of David. In mid-1940, the Nuremberg race laws take effect here too. Jewish citizens are systematically deprived of their rights and plundered. On request of any German authority in need of laborers, Jews are picked up on the street and taken away in convoys. Soon, so-called Jewish councils are set up, and one of their tasks is to provide workers whenever the Germans demand it. Hitler spends the spring of 1940 on the Berghof near Berchtesgaden, from where this private footage originates. His entourage, consisting of adjutants, secretaries, and old companions, is assembled on the terrace. The dictator is planning the war against France. He believes that if he manages to win it before Great Britain can gain a foothold on the continent, the British will be begging for peace. Since France declared war on Germany, the border separating the two countries has been fortified. All traffic connections have been severed. Edgar Forsberg's Bear Division, or Bärendivision, has meanwhile been transferred to the Saarland. demonstrating its readiness for action in maneuvers with gas masks and smoke grenades. It has been quiet for months now on the Western Front. The French gave this phase the name drôle de guerre, the phony war. The blitzkrieg against France begins on the 10th of May 1940 with the Operation Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. 118 Wehrmacht divisions push through neutral Belgium, Holland and Luxembourg and move in on France. Within days, the French lose tens of thousands of soldiers. Over 1 million are taken prisoner. How the Germans managed to overrun the British and French forces so easily is a matter of debate to this day. For the Allied armies have more soldiers than the Wehrmacht and twice as many artillery pieces. Hundreds of thousands become refugees. Charles de Gaulle later writes in his memoirs, France's fate was sealed in just 1 week. The advance of the Wehrmacht happened so quickly that the propaganda machinery can hardly keep up with capturing the victorious campaign on film. In the summer of 1940, the Battle of France is reenacted, and a color film titled Artillerie greift ein, Artillery Intervenes, is made. In actual fact, the resistance of the French and British forces is broken after just a few weeks. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers are cut off and trapped near Dunkirk. Then Hitler orders his panzer divisions to halt, wanting to conserve them for the advance southwards. Luftwaffe commander Göring has promised to finish off the enemy forces with his aircraft. But despite heavy bombardment, nearly 340,000 British and French soldiers can be evacuated on ships. Here, Hitler arrives at the airfield in the town of Cambrai in northern France on the 2nd of June 1940. Wounded German soldiers were hastily flown in to serve as accessories in the Führer's propagandist appearance. Hitler's pilot Hans Bauer documents the scene with his camera. The victorious Wehrmacht leaders at lunch. On the 13th of June, the French government declares Paris an open city. On the following day, the Wehrmacht marches into France's capital. 4 days later, the French government under Marshal Pétain appeals for an armistice. A triumphant Hitler takes a tour around occupied Paris at dawn. This film was taken on the front terrace of the Palace on the Trocadero. Albert Speer later reports that it was at this moment that Hitler decided to refrain from his plans to destroy Paris. When we are finished in Berlin, he apparently told his architect, Paris will only be a shadow. On the afternoon of the 21st of June 1940, Hitler arrives at Compiègne, a city northeast of Paris. The dictator wants to be present at the signing of France's submission. For the occasion, he had the same railway carriage in which the Germans had to sign the surrender armistice that marked the end of World War I taken out of the museum. The dictator wants moderate armistice terms. All his words reflect his wish to come to a conclusion swiftly, comments the Italian foreign minister. Hitler is like a player who has broken the bank. He just wants to leave the gambling table without risking anything anymore.
His reaction towards the French was a relatively lenient peace because he was already thinking of the next step, and the next step was the Soviet Union. So within a matter only of a few weeks after this stupendous victory over the French and forced the British back across the Channel, Hitler was now telling his generals to prepare for the war against the Soviet Union which he was envisaging as taking place in the spring of the following year, spring of 1941. The way he put this to his generals, the strategic motive for the attack on the Soviet Union was now that he couldn't get the British out of the war. The British were adamant they were now not moving to come to any terms with Germany, even after the defeat of France. So what Hitler said to his generals was that we have to destroy Britain's last hope on the continent, which is the Soviet Union. If we destroy the Soviet Union, Britain will be forced to come to terms. America, standing in the shadows behind Great Britain, would then keep to its own hemisphere. Germany will effectively then have won the war. So the notion was defeat London via Moscow.
On the 6th of July 1940, Hitler returns to Berlin as a victorious commander-in-chief. Nazi Germany is in a state of triumphant euphoria. The Reich's capital, in the summer of 1940, peace has temporarily returned after the successful campaigns against Poland and France. The war seems a long way away, and Germans enjoy the summer. Just like every other summer, Berliners bask in the sun around the Wannsee Lake. Absolute calm in politics and warfare, notes Propaganda Minister Goebbels in his diary. Hitler's lover, Eva Braun, is on holiday in Italy, here on the beach of Parigi near Portofino. Braun is allowed to travel only in the company of her sister and her mother. Only Hitler's inner circle knows of Eva's existence. She is kept away from the public eye. Following the resignation of Neville Chamberlain on the 10th of May 1940, Winston Churchill is installed as Great Britain's Prime Minister. Within a few weeks, he becomes Hitler's worst enemy.
Churchill rapidly developed into the complete antithesis of Hitler, this symbol of British defiance and resistance. And in late May, Churchill succeeded in persuading the British War Cabinet not to come to terms with Hitler via Mussolini, but to stay in the war, although at that time he had no hopes, no immediate hopes certainly, of any help from America. Britain stayed in the war, managed to get the troops back from Dunkirk. Churchill turned a major defeat into a great triumph and spoke about the miracle of Dunkirk. And from then on, his speeches from late May 1940 onwards, the speeches that he gave became themselves a rhetorical weapon of British resistance to Germany and a very important element in shoring up British morale at that time.
The Battle of Britain begins in July 1940. The objective of the campaign being to prepare an invasion of the island. The Germans can now use airfields in Belgium, Holland, and northern France, enabling them to fly with less fuel and thus carry larger payloads. Despite the disaster in France, morale in Britain is high, not least thanks to Winston Churchill, whose fervent speeches inspire the population. In the air battles over England, Royal Air Force pilots inflict heavy losses on the German Luftwaffe. Hitler promotes a dozen generals to the rank of Field Marshal and appoints Hermann Göring Reichsmarschall. The dictator appeals to the British to yield to reason, but the government in London categorically rejects negotiations with the Nazis, thus risking an invasion of Britain by the Wehrmacht, which is already in preparation under the codename Operation Sea Lion. The Führer promises his allies that he will soon break the kingdom's resistance.
Hitler himself had cold feet about this from the very beginning. It was a risky venture from the German point of view because in the short time available they couldn't get together sufficient ships to bring about a speedy landing of German troops, and the fear was that the British Navy, or the part of the Navy that was kept in Scapa Flow off Scotland, would come down there and destroy the landing. Once the Luftwaffe did not succeed in destroying the British Royal Air Force, but on the contrary suffered very severe losses. Operation Sea Lion was then postponed until the spring of 1941, but in reality postponed indefinitely.
In spite of everything, London becomes the main target of German bombing raids that go on for months. The Führer's declared intention is to wipe the capital of the empire from the face of the earth. Hitler's bombers also fly raids over British industrial cities, such as Coventry, hoping to weaken the morale of the population. By the end of 1940, some 23,000 people will have died from the airstrikes in Britain. Berlin's citizens, on the other hand, stare in astonishment when a bomb hits their city. The first RAF air raids on German cities occur in the summer of 1940. A few times the bombers even reach the Reich's capital. Churchill wants to show the Nazis that their center of power is within reach and vulnerable. Though Hitler is outraged, Goebbels is happy about this new development. Now Berlin is also right in the middle of the war, he writes, and this is a good thing. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov witnesses an air raid when he visits Berlin in November. After the signing of the Non-Aggression Pact, Stalin led a campaign against Finland that involved heavy losses, and thanks to the pact's secret protocol, annexed eastern Poland and the Baltic states. The alliance still holds, yet before the year is out, Hitler decrees that the planning for the war against the Soviet Union be concluded by May 1941. One part of occupied Poland has meanwhile been incorporated into the Reich. The remainder is named General Government and placed under German administration. These territories are home to some 1.4 million Jews. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to them. After the victory over France, one option that is debated for some time is to banish all Jews from the German sphere of control to the island of Madagascar. At the same time, however, the plans for mass deportations to the furthest east of the General Government, where concentration camps are to be built, are already available. For now, many Jews are recruited as slave laborers. After the recent victories, many Germans naively believe that peace will now return. The few remaining regime critics know better.
Karl Friedrich Goerdeler
writes, "The debt of the German Reich is so high that it cannot be paid back even if subjugated Poland and France are pillaged completely. Should the war end now with a compromise peace, the German people will have to face a budget consolidation with unavoidable necessity." He assumes that the Nazi regime will follow the easy path, continue the war and attack more and more countries.
Hobby filmmaker Götz Hirtreger is trained as a radio operator in the Schlieffen barracks near Berlin. It is the winter of 1940-1941, and more young men are drilled for Hitler's new war plans. German soldiers march on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. The military presence can be felt in the French capital. Over 20,000 Wehrmacht troops are stationed in the city, and the victors are eager to show to the defeated who's the boss. The orders of the German subjugators are enforced relentlessly. The occupation regime subjects the country's entire economy to the German budgetary planning. Jewish businesses are methodically Aryanized. Those who possess the money and contacts flee the country.
They introduced a system according to which German soldiers could take money with them or have money sent to them when they were stationed in the occupied countries, which they could then exchange to the respective local currency. So the soldiers took their money to the staff paymaster's office in, say, France, and this money went into the coffers of the Reich as tax revenue. And what they got in exchange was French francs, Norwegian krona, or Polish zloty that came out of the occupation costs of the respective country, which of course was at the expense of the country's economy.
The sweet life of the occupying forces is organized and overseen by Wehrmacht doctors. They commandeer brothels all around France, where prostitutes entertain the German troops. Commissioned officers favor more sophisticated sexual services. This rare footage originates from one such upmarket establishment and is probably shot in occupied Paris. On the 1st of May 1941, Adolf Hitler visits Vienna. Just as during his 1938 visit, Austrians line the streets to celebrate their Führer. His charisma is still unbroken. The dictator believes he is ready for the campaign against the Soviet Union, but his plans change in April 1941. He must first send his troops to a different front. The military intervention of his Italian allies in Greece is about to turn into a disaster, so the Wehrmacht invades Yugoslavia first and then marches into Greece. Gottfried Kessel, an officer with the infantry regiment Großdeutschland, is a keen hobby filmmaker. His unit assigns him the task of keeping a war diary on film. After 11 days of fighting, the Yugoslav army surrenders unconditionally. Some 350,000 soldiers become prisoners of war. This footage is filmed by Kessel in occupied Belgrade, shortly after the capitulation. Serbian soldiers are imprisoned in the citadel of the Yugoslav capital. On the 22nd of April, Kessel records a brutal retaliatory action of the Wehrmacht. As a reprisal for the killing of 2 SS officers and 9 civilians by partisans, 12 former Serbian soldiers are executed by the cemetery wall in Pančevo. The influence of Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess has been dwindling since the start of the war. Aware of the imminent campaign against Stalin, he entertains hopes of a peace agreement with Great Britain. On the 10th of May, Hess flies to Scotland alone in an aircraft manufactured by Messerschmitt, believing he can instigate peace talks with the British government.
When Hess flew to Scotland in May 1941, it was in a vain attempt to persuade the British now to enter into the alliance with Germany, which Hitler had always wanted, but which had then, of course, been hopes of which had long been destroyed. And at the last minute, Hess, worried about the prospect of a two-front war, now thought that he personally could intervene, use his contacts within the British establishment, maybe even to reach the king himself, to persuade the British to see sense and at least not stand in Germany's way in this. Of course, all that happened was that Hess was arrested, imprisoned, and the British, surprisingly, to some extent, did not make as much of a propaganda coup out of this as might have been thought.
Hess's attempt is presented to the German public as an act of treason. Hess was delusional, proclaims Hitler, and strips him of all his party offices. The Führer is devastated, Goebbels writes in his diary. What an image for the world to see. A mentally disturbed man was second in command behind the Führer. Appalling and unthinkable. During the course of 1941, the British intensify their air raids on cities in the Third Reich. Time after time, the Royal Air Force bombers managed to break through the German anti-aircraft positions. This footage is filmed clandestinely after a British bombing raid on Berlin. In order to preserve the population's resolution, such films are forbidden. The early hours of the 22nd of June 1941 marked the launch of Operation Barbarossa. From East Prussia, the 20th Panzer Group of the Army Group Center, Heeresgruppe Mitte, marches into Belarus. Götz Hertreger, the radio operator on duty, films the first days of the conflict. The Red Army is taken by surprise, and within 4 weeks Hitler's soldiers advance deep into Ukraine. The Nazi leaders think they will be able to crush the giant with feet of clay in one blow.
Der Krieg gegen die Sowjetunion ist ganz klar.
The war against the USSR was quite clearly a war with primarily economic and political objectives. From the start, the entire planning was based, on the one hand, on the assessment of the Reich Ministry of Nutrition that tens of millions of people in the Soviet Union would have to die in order that the Germans could avail themselves of the agricultural produce, especially in Ukraine. The corresponding directive was drawn up several weeks before the war began. The other main objective was raw materials, to take possession of the oil fields in Baku, but also of the coal and iron ore deposits, and utilize them for the Nazi war machinery.
Hitler's battle-tried divisions inflict heavy defeats on the Red Army. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops are captured. The Führer orders that all political commissioners be executed at once. The rest are cooped up in provisional camps. The survivors are taken to Germany and become slave laborers.
When the invasion took place then, this immense invasion on the 22nd of June, the Soviet troops were very handily placed for rapid German takeover, massive numbers of Soviet troops taken prisoner in the first stage, very swift progress made, and it looked as if the war would be over very rapidly, which is what the German leadership expected. Hitler himself said 4 or 5 months. Some of the military thought even less than that. But they weren't on their own, because British intelligence and American intelligence reckoned that the Germans would win this victory within weeks, not within months. So it was an extraordinary period where the Chief of the General Staff, Halder, thought after a couple of weeks that the war was basically already won. He had rapidly to change his mind on that one.
In late August, the dictator arrives in Ukraine to visit the troops. The vast territories of Russia, Hitler declares, will soon become Lebensraum for German settlers. The soldiers greet their supreme commander with frenetic cheering. Most of them are unaware that a genocide is already underway behind the front.
Almost certainly there was no written order ever given. We have to see a number of authorizations from Hitler coming from the summer or even the spring of 1941, before the launch of Barbarossa, for the destruction of the Jews in the Soviet Union, and then in the autumn of 1941, orders for Hitler for the deportation of German Jews into an area where already partial genocides are taking place, and further authorizations until we come to the stage, after a period of about 6 months of these partial genocides getting larger and larger and extending more and more, until by the spring of 1942 we're in the position where outright genocide involving the whole of the Jews in German-occupied Europe is now envisaged.
Accompanied by a camera crew, Chief of SS Heinrich Himmler visits a camp of Soviet prisoners of war near Minsk. As of the 2nd of July, so-called SS task forces are deployed behind the front lines with orders to liquidate Soviet party functionaries and Jews. The murders are referred to as retaliatory measures. In late July 1941, on the outskirts of the city of Libau, modern Liepaja in Latvia, Marine Reinhard Wiener filmed the execution of Jews by one such task force. More than 500,000 Jews in total fall victim to German hit squads during the first 5 months of Barbarossa. Ghettoes for the Jewish population are established all over occupied Poland. In the city of Krakow, too, the remaining Jews are segregated into the ghetto, taking only a few of their belongings with them. Like a huge dragnet, the Nazis herd together their victims from all around Europe. Before long, conditions for the deported will deteriorate rapidly.
During the first 2 war years, the German Reich supplied occupied Poland with food. Then at the end of 1941, the Minister for Nutrition says they must send food to us now, and travels to Krakow to bring the news home to the German occupation administration. And they say, we can't do that. We will have hunger revolts, and we don't have enough police forces. How can we enforce that? Do you know what he told them? Soon, he said, this land will be cleansed of Jews. Obviously meaning that they would all be exterminated. So there would be 2 million fewer mouths to feed in this country.
Hans Frank, an old companion of Hitler, is the Governor-General of Poland from October 1939. The eloquent lawyer is one of the architects of the genocide from the very start. The 2 million Jews living in his sphere of influence are ruthlessly and brutally oppressed. Rain and mud slow down the advance of the German troops deeper into the USSR. According to the original plan, Moscow should have already been taken. Also, their supplies are running low and the equipment is deficient.
It's a known fact that the German army marched into the Soviet Union without winter equipment. The reason was that their advance would have been a lot slower if they'd had to drag the equipment along, so they set off with lightweight tackle. Here too, one can recognize the 3-month calculation in Hitler's political thinking. We either make it or we don't. And if we don't, then we will go down. But in order to make it, we must put all our eggs in one basket. Ultimately, this is what brought about the disaster outside Moscow and Leningrad in the winter of 1941 to 42.
Hitler orders an attack on Moscow, but the emaciated troops on the front have to halt their advance in the snowdrifts. Of course, the German propaganda presents a different picture.
Südwestlich von Moskau greifen die Panzer der Gruppe Guderian an. Die Bolschewiken hatten auch hier die Dörfer zu festungsartigen Stützpunkten ausgebaut, um die zähe und hartnäckig gekämpft werden musste. Die deutschen Infanteristen, Pioniere und Panzerschützen zeigten sich auch hier den Sowjets kämpferisch weit überlegen. Nur die besten Soldaten der Welt werden auch mit diesen ungeheuren Schwierigkeiten fertig.
These images are from early November 1941 in the Special Shop for Jews in Stuttgart's Seestraße. At this time, 163,000 Jews still live in the Third Reich. They are required to wear the Star of David on their clothing. This propaganda film, titled The Jewish Store, is supposed to demonstrate that Jews in Germany have access to food, just like the Aryan population. On December the 7th, the coordinates of the Second World War change abruptly when Japanese bombers and fighters attack the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor on Hawaii. For U.S. President Roosevelt, the attack comes at the right time. Pearl Harbor plunges the country into a patriotic frenzy. America declares war on Japan, and Hitler reacts promptly.
Am 11. Dezember, 3 Tage nach dem Kriegsausbruch zwischen Japan und den USA, sprach der Führer vor dem Reichstag zum deutschen Volk. Deutschland und Italien hätten sich nunmehr entschlossen, Seite an Seite mit Japan, gemeinsam den Kampf zur Verteidigung der Freiheit und Unabhängigkeit ihrer Völker und Reiche gegen die Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika und England zu führen.
From Hitler's own perspective, this attack by Japan gave him now a chance, he thought, to win the war. And the chance was that the Japanese would now tie down the Americans in the Pacific. This would then free up the U-boats to attack in the Atlantic, and the Atlantic War, he thought, would be decisive. The Battle of the Atlantic would be decisive because if the German U-boats could prevent American shipping getting to Britain, Britain would be once more forced to come to the conference table, and Germany would effectively have won the war in Europe. So the attack on Pearl Harbor momentarily seemed to give Hitler the chance that he had been wanting.
In a show of self-confidence, Nazi Germany sends its U-boats to the US coast in order to disrupt the supply lines between America and Britain. The propaganda proudly shows images of New York, filmed by a newsreel cameraman. To begin with, Operation Drumbeat is successful.
Bei Bei einbrechender Dunkelheit wird ein Tanker gesichtet. Das Boot läuft auf Angriffsposition. Tor 1 klar. Treffer! Bei seiner Rückkehr erzählte Kapitänleutnant Topp: Wir haben den Amerikanern diesmal einen Fackelzug von brennenden Tankern gebracht.
The U-boat captains willingly supply the propaganda machinery with a distorted picture of a chivalrous war.
Kapitänleutnant Topp versenkte mit seinem Boot bisher 208.000 Tonnen feindlichen Schiffsraumes. Auf seiner letzten Fahrt schickte er allein 7 feindliche Handelsschiffe, darunter 5 voll beladene Tanker auf den Meeresgrund.
Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels sees to it that such reports are eagerly absorbed by the Germans. As Hitler now appears very rarely in public, Goebbels takes on the role of the dictator on the home front. This footage is filmed during a speech in Munich, but was never shown in German cinemas. The time is not yet ripe for Goebbels' total war. Over 3 million Soviet soldiers have been captured during Operation Barbarossa. The propaganda portrays them as inferior people, Untermenschen, who deserve no pity or help from the German population. The prisoners are severely neglected. Hundreds of thousands of them die in the camps in 1942. In late April 1942, Benito Mussolini visits Hitler on the Obersalzberg. The two dictators demonstrate unity and strength. However, the situation is precarious. The joint campaign against the USSR is deadlocked, while in North Africa their troops have come under pressure. The Afrika Korps can hold its ground for a while and even manages to weaken the British expeditionary forces. These images are filmed during that time by an unknown amateur filmmaker. A private is awarded the Knight's Cross. This distinction for bravery is one of the highest military decorations, but is awarded more frequently as the war progresses. The soldiers are still blithe and confident of their victory. Jews from Stuttgart are congregated in an assembly camp, ready to start their journey to the east as requested by the German authorities. Most of them believe they will be interned in labor camps. Ministry and security forces officials, however, are long privy to the fact that the final solution is already underway. 11 million European Jews are to be deported to extermination camps.
By the spring of 1942, then the process of partial genocides are now congealed into one all-out attempt to destroy the Jews physically throughout Europe. And this process was now unstoppable. The machinery had been set up, the bureaucratic apparatus was in place, and the Jews were being caught and deported in whichever country they were to be found. So the process was now unstoppable. There was a momentum, a dynamic that had been set into place, which was now really independent of any particular individual. It would continue until the Jews were destroyed.
The Warsaw Ghetto houses some 400,000 people. They live like tinned sardines in appalling conditions. A classified report issued by the German propaganda department on the 21st of March 1942 reads, "The number of deaths in the ghetto still fluctuates around 5,000 per month." A doctor in the ghetto reports, people fall asleep in a bed or on the street and are dead by the following morning. And the German governor of Warsaw predicts, all that will remain of the Jewish question will be a cemetery.